Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Gray Matter commentary. So much has been said and written about this tragic shooting in Tumbler Ridge, but I thought that I would treat this subject myself and maybe give it a bit of a different look. It's called Canadian Cowardice: How Tumbler Ridge Reveals a Deeper Problem. Begin with a quotation from a well known podcaster named Matt Walsh, who said, "Trans people are the most dangerous and unstable group in existence, and it's not close. The entire gender transition industry must be forcibly shut down immediately, not just for the sake of the gender confused people it preys upon, but for the safety of the general public." End quote. Well, a so called trans woman has killed 9 people in gun controlled Canada. Our woke establishment tried very hard to hide the killer's mental illness, but the truth emerged and reminded us that it is not the killer and not the gun that is the real issue. A horrible tragedy occurred on the 10th of February when a killer, later described as a trans identifying woman, shot 9 innocent people to death and injured 27 others before turning the gun on himself. Canadian media, police, and government tried desperately to hide the truth about the shooter, but this was a secret that the establishment simply could not suppress. The incident occurred at the Tumbler Ridge Secondary School in the tiny community of Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. The killer began by murdering 2 people at home before heading to a secondary school for grade 7 to 12 kids, where he opened fire. 6 people died on school grounds, and 1 more died en route to hospital. The initial police alert described the shooter as a female in dress with brown hair. Almost instantly, though, social media users deduced that the shooter was probably a member of the mentally ill cohort who claimed to be the opposite of their biological sex. And this guess was a reasonable one given the disproportionate number of so-called transgender mass shootings in the last few years. In 2018, a trans woman killed 3 in Aberdeen, Maryland. In 2019, a trans man working with a partner killed 1 and injured 8 in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. In 2022, a non-binary person killed 5 and injured 19 in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And in 2023, a trans man killed 6 in Nashville, Tennessee. And in August 2025, a trans woman killed 3 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And finally, while Tyler Robinson, soon to be tried for assassinating Charlie Kirk, does not identify as trans, he was in a romantic relationship with a man who did. Now, considering that less than 1% of the population in the US and Canada identifies as transgender, they certainly have racked up a rather high body count. Add in the fact that women are rarely perpetrators unless, like the Nashville shooter, they are gripped by transgender madness, and it was a pretty safe bet that the female in a dress shooter in Tumbler Ridge was actually a man. There are, of course, no transgender people. This is mythical. There are only 2 sexes. But there are mentally ill people. Some suffer from multiple simultaneous mental illnesses, while others are responding to societal factors like disastrous family lives, mothers with personality disorders, or social pressure from peer groups and social media. It may also be that some are reflecting the pill's ubiquity, which is altering the hormonal wash babies receive in utero. If that is the case, then the best way to treat trans people would be to give them hormones aligning with their own natural biology. If leftists were not politically committed to the fantasy of so-called transgenderism, then these mentally, physically, or socially ill people would get the help that they so desperately need. And this might come in the form of therapy or medication or even institutionalization. What they would not get is the constant assurance that all is right with them, no matter how miserable they are. The problem, these wretched people are told, is the outer world. Add in prescription hormones, making naturally aggressive men emotional, or that make emotional women aggressive, and you beget a class of violent killers. Of course, the Canadian establishment refuses to acknowledge this reality. It is instead sticking to the female shooter narrative. The one thing we can expect to come out of Canada now is an even more aggressive push for total gun control in a nation that is already one of the most heavily controlled countries in the world. Of course, the Canadian establishment refuses to acknowledge this reality, is instead sticking to the female shooter narrative. The one thing we can expect to come out of Canada now is an even more aggressive push for total gun control in a nation that is already one of the most heavily controlled countries in the world. Of course, gun control is a leftist fiction that simply places more power in the hands of government. The reality is that despite its gun control policies, Canada has had several high profile mass shootings in the past 2 decades, and gun related crime is on the rise. When we exclude generic gang killings in urban areas, and there have been a lot of those, the non gang shootings over the past 20 years have been the Dawson College shooting with 1 dead and 19 injured, the Moncton shooting with 3 dead and 2 injured, the La Loche shooting with 4 dead and 7 injured, the Quebec City mosque shooting with 6 dead and 5 injured, the Danforth shooting, 2 dead, 13 injured, the Fredericton shooting, 4 dead, the Nova Scotia shootings, 22 dead and 3 injured, the Langley shootings, 2 dead and 2 injured, and now the Tumbler Ridge shooting with 8 dead and 27 injured. That is a pretty high death toll, which strangely excludes the Yukon, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, where per capita private gun ownership is higher than anywhere else in Canada. So, what the left refuses to acknowledge is that guns are tools, efficient tools, admittedly, but they have no independent agency. They function only when someone uses them, whether for good or ill. Most people in Canada use them for good. This is patently true. Otherwise, we'd be living in the literal Wild West. However, there is evil in this world, and evil people like Jesse Strang, the 18-year-old Tumbler Ridge shooter, will use the weapons at hand. The real problems begin when we have cultures that do not value human life, like leftism and Islam, that glorify violent death, like Hollywood, that encourage insanity, leftists, or religious violence, Islam, and that refuse to provide meaningful consequence for such violent killers. And in the case of Jesse Strang, the RCMP confirmed that Strang was a biological male who began identifying as female about 6 years ago. Strang had a documented history of mental health struggles. Police attended the family home on multiple occasions over the years. He was apprehended more than once under the Mental Health Act and taken for assessment. The most recent visit came in the spring of last year, prompted by concerns around his well-being and proclivity to self-harm. Here is where the hard questions must begin. According to the RCMP, officers seized firearms from Strang's residence roughly 2 years ago, pursuant to a criminal code warrant. Those guns were later returned after the lawful owner successfully petitioned for their release. RCMP were back in the home just a month before the Tumbler Ridge rampage. Strang himself did not have any firearms registered in his own name. His license had expired in 2024, but the weapons used were removed at the scene: a long gun and a modified handgun. Why were these guns returned to the home when there was a clear recent record of serious mental health interventions? That's a very good question. And what exact criteria does the system use to decide that a household is once again safe enough for firearms possession after repeated police calls and involuntary psychiatric committals? It's another good question. Unverified reports also circulate that Strang had been on puberty blockers as part of his transition. This is unverified by official statements, but is consistent with the timeline of his self identification as female as early as age 12. And if that is confirmed, then it raises an even sharper question. Should a history of cross sex hormones or puberty blockers in a young person automatically trigger a temporary or even permanent prohibition on access to firearms, even through family members? Mental health flags already exist in the licensing process. But should medical gender transition be treated as a comparable red flag, given the now well documented psychiatric risks involved? Well, perhaps the deepest systemic failure arises within the approach itself. By all accounts, this was a household in crisis. Strang was a profoundly troubled young man, awash in mental health issues that police had been dealing with for several years. Rather than helping him to face his demons, the system fed him a chemical cocktail of puberty blockers and hormones, telling him that gender is fluid. They did not treat the underlying trauma, depression, or whatever else was rotting inside him. They just affirmed the delusion and hoped for the best. Strang was a coward who walked into a school full of defenseless children to slaughter them. For years now, the prevailing model in Canada and elsewhere has been reckless affirmation and aggressive medicalization, puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, and immediate social transition. Such interventions are handed out with shockingly little exploration of underlying trauma, of autism or depression, family breakdown, or the simple storm of adolescence. What if the problem was never the wrong body at all? What if many of these troubled young people like Strang simply needed help learning to love the body that God gave them? Well, instead of rushing kids into a potion of hormone blockers that can permanently damage their fertility, bone density, sexual function, and cognitive development, what if we had the courage to ask the hard, obvious questions first? Questions like this: are you going through puberty and finding it confusing, awkward, and even terrifying? And is this discomfort normal? Something almost every human being has felt, and maybe there is nothing basically wrong with you? And could this be social contagion, bullying, porn exposure, or unresolved mental health issues masquerading as a gender crisis? Therapy that actually digs into why a young person like Strang has come to despise their own healthy body, rather than immediately affirming that hatred as truth, steering them toward chemical castration in the operating room. While other countries like the US, Sweden, and Italy have reined in gender ideology madness, Canada still embraces it. And the response to the Tumbler Ridge killings is a sad and sorry example of this reality. The Tumbler Ridge shootings have made it clear that we can no longer ignore the elephant in the room. And yet, police authorities and the mainstream media are doing just that. We've already seen the obfuscation and avoidance on the part of the media and the police, unwilling to say the quiet part out loud. When the killings were in progress, the RCMP sent out emergency alerts to local residents. It described the killer as a female wearing a dress with brown hair. In an initial news briefing on the tragedy, an RCMP spokesperson called Strang a gun person, as though we would not see such awkward wording as a telltale sign that they were trying to disguise Strang's sexual identity. In a follow-up news conference, when pressed to provide more details on the killer, RCMP Deputy Commissioner Dwayne McDonald called Strang a female, not a transgender woman, a female. So here you have a senior spokesperson for Canada's National Police Force publicly calling a male killer a female, with the clear intention to mislead us into believing that Strang was actually a woman. So, this is where we find ourselves today in Canada. Our national police are more concerned with respecting the preferred sexual identity of a dead mass murderer than they are about caring for the families of his child victims. You just could not make such madness up, nor did it go unnoticed on the international stage. Piers Morgan posted the following observation on X after Reuters simply regurgitated the lie spun by the RCMP. Quote, "Woman, it was a biological man. Facts matter," end quote. Then there was CBC, stalling to identify the shooter as Jesse Strang, even as independent media had discovered and confirmed his identity almost 12 hours earlier through actual investigative journalism. Of course, there was the usual leftist nonsense about not knowing what could possibly be the motive or at the heart of this tragedy coming up again from both the police and media talking heads. The truth is that it really is not difficult to figure out if they were being honest about it. Is it possible that Strang, a troubled teen, was seduced into the transgender cult by online influencers who convinced him that changing his sex would solve all of his problems? Or could it be that when he sought help, medical gender ideologues first pumped him full of puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, and antidepressants? Or that he continued to self medicate with an array of drugs, including cannabis and psychedelic mushrooms? That he likely began to realize that changing his sex had solved none of his original problems and only made them worse. That it all came crashing down, culminating in a mental breakdown or a psychotic break that drove him to a demonic killing spree, which ended the lives of his mother, his stepbrother, another adult, and several innocent schoolchildren. Well, this scenario is likely closer to the truth than anything being spouted by the RCMP and the lamestream media, who continue to insist upon calling the man named Jesse Strang a female in the headlines. And this is just another one of the many reasons why it is time to reevaluate the state of Canada when it comes to issues like transgenderism and gender ideology. It is now abundantly clear that this country's governments, its institutions, educational systems, and media are unable or unwilling to condemn or even rein in the toxic, murderous cult that caused the Tumbler Ridge tragedy. While most every other Western nation has reconsidered gender self identification policies and gender affirming care for minors, Canada has doubled down. The UK, US, and the Nordic nations, along with many other European countries, have declared moratoria or ended both medical transitioning and social engineering practices related to gender ideology and gender medicalization for children and teens. In fact, Canadian legislators have done little to put real guardrails on these dubious, dangerous medical practices. Mutilating gender reassignment surgeries, often benignly referred to as top and bottom procedures, can only be performed on adult patients in most provinces. However, there is evidence that Ontario has approved and paid for such surgeries for minors to be performed out of province. In most Canadian jurisdictions, puberty blockers, delaying adolescence, and cross hormone therapies are readily available to minors, often after a single visit to a gender clinic and with little medical or psychological examinations or oversight. And these include radical double mastectomies for girls, removing sexual organs and replacing them with prosthetic facsimiles that represent sexual organs of the opposite sex. On other key aspects of gender ideology, Canada has barely moved the needle. The federal government and most provinces have done little to keep men and adolescent boys claiming to be female out of spaces formerly reserved for women. This is true in sports, locker rooms, prisons, and even washrooms. And the same is true with regulating or restricting the spread of SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender ideology, which is simply a euphemism for indoctrinating elementary school kids into gender ideology under the guise of health education. SOGI is often implemented and stridently defended by woke school boards. In reporting on gender issues, Canadian mainstream media leans heavily to the left in favor of radical gender ideologues and LGBTQ activists. Premier Danielle Smith has made efforts to rein in gender ideology in Alberta, but has been roundly criticized for doing so. People like Justin Trudeau and former Alberta Premier Rachel Notley accuse Smith of playing politics with the lives of vulnerable children and promoting transgender genocide by denying trans youth life saving, gender affirming care. Yes, folks, you heard that correctly, transgender genocide. This was their response to her government enacting policies to ban puberty blockers, cross sex hormone therapies, and any type of sex reassignment for minors, to severely restrict the teaching of SOGI in schools, and to require schools to inform parents if their children are changing their personal pronouns. She also passed legislation prohibiting males who have undergone puberty and identify as female from competing in female amateur sports competitions. Other provinces have also attempted to tackle issues around this radical ideology. In 2023, New Brunswick Conservative Premier Blair Higgs reversed a policy allowing schools there not to tell parents if their kids tried to change their pronouns or socially transition at school. He required schools to inform and involve parents in the matter. Makes sense, right? In Saskatchewan, Premier Scott Moe enacted a similar pronoun policy, but it has been stymied by a court ruling that gender activists can continue to challenge the policy. Canadian premiers in the rest of the country have remained mute on these important matters, likely for fear of being painted as transphobic bigots and right-wing extremists by activists, LGBTQ lobbyists, liberal politicians, and of course, their taxpayer-funded mainstream media. This, sadly, is the state of affairs, even though most Canadians and sane people in many parts of the world have finally concluded that the notion that a person can decide to change their sex is absurd. Despite this, organizations like Skate Canada, the Canadian Medical Association, and the Canadian Pediatric Society remain captured by gender ideology. PHAC actually promotes the use of puberty blockers, even providing false assurances that these drugs are fully reversible and safe. It is therefore clear that the gender ideology movement is still wholly supported by Canadian institutions, academia, liberal media, and politicians. This allows medical practitioners steeped in this cult to cut corners and ignore other red flags when it comes to the mental state of their patients. Other elements of this movement also stoke irrational fears about the outside threats they may face as a trans person, only adding to their existing delusions. And all of this can only light the fuse to a ticking bomb that will ultimately explode and result in more needless deaths. The cultural redefinition of gender identity and expression has progressed at breathtaking speed. And this redefinition follows our corrupt cultural and governmental rejection of biblical marriage and sexuality that has unfolded in recent decades. This redefinition of gender identity is a natural consequence of denying God's plan for human flourishing through his created design for us. So, what is the courageous Christian response to the gender ideology cult that has gripped Canada? Well, for thousands of years, gender has been viewed as synonymous with biological sex and in exclusively binary terms. There were simply no other categories than man or woman. And while gender expressions such as the manner of dress and roles within society have varied from culture to culture, Christians have always seen gender as binary. The corrupt culture tells us that gender is not determined by biology, but rather is based upon identity and self expression. It tells us that we can now choose our gender based upon whatever our feelings best identify with. Gender is also considered fluid, so that whatever gender we identify with today could be different tomorrow. And this has led government, institutions, and corporations to allow individuals to select from multiple gender options. In fact, one large social media company has 50 gender identity options for user profiles. 50. New frontiers are being crossed every day, with some now identifying with the age they feel rather than their chronological age, with animals or with characters from fantasy movies like vampires. And to be clear, these individuals are not role playing. They have genuinely adopted such identities as their own and live accordingly. What is perhaps more shocking is that our schools are urging children to determine their own identity. Now, a child like 12-year-old Jesse Strang, who is developmentally unable to think in concrete terms, who is too young to drive, to vote, or work, can determine their gender identity. The government also asserts that the child's identity may be protected under privacy laws so that parents are prevented from knowing about it. While such examples may be troubling, some might ask what all the fuss is about. Why should we care about a person's choice of identity? Is it not really just their own business? The answer clearly is no, it is not. Our gender affects how others interact with us. For thousands of years, that is how societies have rationally functioned. Men do not interact with men as they do with women, and vice versa. Those who argue for gender fluidity do not just want to be left alone, they instead demand that we validate their disordered choices by altering our own behavior to conform to their warped view of reality. They want us to treat them consistent with their chosen identity, not their biological sex. A BC Human Rights Tribunal, in fact, just ordered a heterosexual man who refused to use a student's preferred pronouns to pay $750,000 in damages. It is therefore clear that arguments about gender identity are not really about private choices, but whether someone has the right to compel others to agree with their choices. Well, Scripture makes clear that gender is not a byproduct of individual choice, but is rather a consequence of divine design. There simply is no biblical evidence of God designing his creation so that the person can choose their own gender. Instead, Scripture clearly teaches that God has designed us as exclusively male or female, without exception. It is fixed in the womb. Quote, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." That's from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And how about this? "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb." That's from Psalm 139, verse 13. So to force Christians to recognize gender identity apart from God's design would cause us to deny God's truth and embrace a manufactured lie. And this is why Paul warns us in Romans chapter 1, verse 24, quote, "God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator." End quote. How we, as image bearers, view our bodies and what we do with them will either hinder or help our worship. Ultimately, the Creator, not the creature, must define what is true in our world. The remedy for transgender struggles is the same as it is for every other aspect of brokenness in our world. It's the gospel. All that Jesus has done for us is graciously received through our faith in him. We are thus reborn to a new identity, providing a far richer inheritance than any false identity we may create for ourselves. That said, living in Canada today, we must recognize that biblical views on gender identity will increasingly become the minority position. We can no longer presume that those with whom we discuss gender identity will agree with or even understand a biblical perspective. We must accept that at times the corrupt culture will label us as intolerant. But our disagreement with the concept of gender identity must never lead us to be cruel or unloving toward those who identify as transgender. Their sin distorts the image of God that they bear, but that sin cannot remove God's image. In James chapter 3, verse 9, we are reminded that it is sinful to belittle, mock, or disrespect anyone bearing the image of God. And since gender dysphoric persons are image bearers, we must love and defend them when others seek to harm them. We must also remember that the corrupt culture's perverse perspective on gender identity results from the fall of mankind and the tendency that we all have towards idolatry. Transgender ideology may shock our Christian sense of what is right, but it truly is not a new category of sin. Humans constantly look to things within the created realm to find validation and identity. Once again, we must take Christ's words to heart and remove the beam in our own eyes before criticizing others. We must see the transgender community, even those as troubled and violent as Jesse Strang, as we would anyone needing the truth and love of the gospel. This does not, however, mean that we can cower under the social pressure to deny God's truth. The late Pastor John MacArthur consistently expressed a conservative Christian view on transgender identity, asserting that there is no such thing as transgender. I heartily agree. He described transgenderism as a lie and a deception, a cultural construct intended as an assault upon God, and even equated it to a form of suicide due to the psychological and spiritual isolation it causes. His views are rooted in a literal interpretation of Scripture. In January of 2022, a sermon delivered by MacArthur on this topic was removed from YouTube after the platform labeled it as hate speech, citing violations of its community guidelines. The removal followed a nationwide protest by evangelical pastors opposing Canada's Bill C-4, which criminalizes biblical teachings on sexuality and gender. Pastor MacArthur emphasized that transgender ideology contradicts God's sovereignty and physical creation and called for confrontation of false ideology from the pulpit. Despite his strong language, he also stated that love and compassion must still be shown to those struggling with gender confusion, while always affirming the truth that God made you exactly the way he wanted you to be. Pastor MacArthur's cautionary final words on transgenderism are especially prophetic for Canadians. Quote, "It won't be very long before the sex and gender revolutionaries target the source of our beliefs, the Holy Bible. I foresee a day in American history where Bibles could be confiscated or rewritten to affirm the LGBTQIA lifestyle." End quote. Well, in Canada, that day has already arrived. And whether Christians in this country will respond to the challenge with courage, with faith, and with conviction to truth remains to be seen. How about you? We close with a quotation. "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." That's from Proverbs chapter 16, verse 25.
Hungry for truth beyond the television? Well, extend the conversation with Grey Matter online. Grey Matter's insights continue in your inbox. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter where we dive deeper into the spiritual battles facing Canadian families today. Equip yourself to stand firm in your faith and lead with godly wisdom. Join our growing community of truth seekers at substack.com/Grey Matter newsletter. Subscribe today and never miss the Canadian perspective on what matters most. Was Jesus a political activist or the victim of history's greatest legal sham? In Leighton's new booklet, Character on Trial, The Real Jesus, Leighton applies a litigator's lens to the evidence of his life and trial. Get your free physical copy for this Easter season by emailing us at greymatterconnect@gmail.com. Don't just take the world's word for it, examine the evidence for yourself. The battle has always been over people and ideas, but they're just the targets. The real enemies are spiritual principalities and powers. Grey Matter's purpose is to reach out with the voice of Christian truth to men between 18 and 44. We believe that these sons and fathers are Christ's inheritance. Join us financially and help us to speak so Canadians hear truth that sets men free and brings families to Jesus. Contact us by email at greymatterconnect@gmail.com or mail us at Post Office Box 2436, Fort Macleod, Alberta, postal code T0L0Z0. Thank you for your support.